Well, that's quite an introduction. But I am reminded of the fact that I'm getting older and that I've been looking at shipwrecks for a very long time. And one of the things that I've come to learn from being a recreational diver for some 30 years and latterly an archaeologist is that shipwrecks have an ability to really surprise. And of course, the whole purpose of archaeology is to study objects, in this case shipwrecks, and to use what we can learn from them to enhance our historical knowledge. I see a lot of television programs and a lot of books about shipwrecks, and where what I tend to see is something which isn't that. And I make quite a lot of this in the introduction of my book, where somehow the shipwreck is seen as a friendly witness, a passive friendly witness. And so one would look at the history book and say, this is what happened, and then the shipwreck is simply there to confirm what goes on. Now, we archaeologists have a term for that, and we call it the fallacy of affirming the consequent. And that's not what I do. I like to look at shipwrecks and let them speak for themselves. They have a unique language, and they are ultimately the ultimate witnesses to their own destruction. So when you can let them speak, they can tell us sometimes things which are genuinely unique that we previously didn't know. And I think the thrust behind my book was to really try and make that point, is to say, look, we have an unbelievable archaeological record on the bottoms of the oceans, covering all sorts of areas, not just the Battle of Jutland. And if we allow these objects to tell us what they know, we will seriously enhance what we know. And I think it's important also, if you think about the Battle of Jutland as just a ginormous, great big car crash, because that's what it was. You know, it's 249 ships, 90,000 sailors, fighting each other for 16 hours. And the larger part of the narrative that we have left is from eyewitnesses. We know now, if you talk to the police, they will tell you how notoriously unreliable eyewitness accounts are. And we think also the fact that there were 90,000 sailors there. But I can tell you that the numbers of sailors that actually saw anything were in the hundreds. The rest were down inside their ships doing their jobs, moving coal, moving ammunition, terrified, wet, and hoping the whole thing will end. Yeah. So it's unsurprising, ultimately, that by studying the shipwrecks, we were going to find things that are new. Now, in a purely academic term, I call that the learning space. And it's the space where history, in its published form and in its archival form, diverges from archaeology. And it's that point of divergence where we learn, and where the shipwrecks can fill in some of the gaps. So that is really what my book was about. And I'm going to show you some examples of how that actually works. Just suffice to say to start with that I've been looking at Jutland for a very long time. I first went out there with a group of like-minded friends and divers in 2000, and went back 3 or 4 times in 2001, and then ended up making a television program with Channel 4 in Discovery in 2003. It's me on the left about to go and do some video recording on HMS Invincible. And it was in 2001 that I came across the gentleman you see on the left, is it Gert Norman Anderson. I went to see him at his facility and to see if there was any means that we could work together. Gert had owned a large underwater contractor, the biggest one in Denmark, and he was really the only person that knew that much about the shipwrecks that were off the Danish coast. And we started collaborating at that point. Later on in 2015, Gert Norman very kindly invited me to come out on a survey of the shipwrecks using a technology that we call multi-beam. And that was really what we needed to piece together everything that I had learned from diving on them to the broader picture that my book represents. And so you've got geophysics, you've got physical interaction with the wrecks, and you've got historical interpretation. But it takes all of those things together to build a package of new knowledge. And of course, I'm assuming in this audience tonight there's a reasonably good understanding of the Battle of Jutland, but this slide really shows you that the action takes place on the Danish coast. The crosses mark the losses actually from the Harper record of where the 25 ships that were sunk were lost during the battle. And in archaeological terms, this turned out to be really quite interesting, because you will know, of course, that the Battle of Jutland is essentially 3 quite distinct actions. You have a a battle cruiser action at the start, then there's the big fleet action in the middle, and then there's a very long-running night action that takes place afterwards. And it actually turns out, fortunately for me, that those three actions don't overlap. They're distinct. And this becomes important ultimately when it came down to trying to work out the identities of some of the sunken destroyers, which are now in a very, very poor state of condition. And so if we'd had all of them jumbled up together, it made my job a lot more difficult than it actually was, but I was able to segment the battlefield into the sections that you see there and work on each one independently, and that was a very great help. The losses, of course, 8,500 sailors died. It's about 10% of the ones that were there, and about 10% of the ships that were sunk. You know, I read in some books on Jutland that it is considered to have been a skirmish. Well, one hell of a skirmish. This is the view I take, and of course, we have to be conscious of the fact that when we study these objects, they are naval graves. And you know, the tough element of doing this sometimes is knowing what happened to these ships when you study them, and made all worse, I have to say, by the fact that, as was alluded to, we've seen a degree of illegal metal theft from these sites over the years. When one comes to study the archive side of the Battle of Jutland, there are certain things that an archaeologist looks for which are sort of important, things to do with the circumstances of destruction in particular, and to see how, if at all, they actually match what we see on the wrecks. And so one exercise that I went through over several years was to look quite carefully at the photographic record and to see whether there were things in there that would be helpful or not to be helpful, as the case may be. And one of the things that came to light was this famous photograph, which I'm sure all of you have seen at some point or another in the published literature. But how many of you actually know that it's a fake? Yeah, it's a fake. And we know this now because what it purports to show, of course, is an explosion of the centre magazines in the ship with a jet of flame supposedly coming out of the magazine that would have been under a turret. The original photograph was found, the photograph the fake was based on was found by Dr. Richard Osborne of the World Ship Society in his own collection. It's a small glass plate, would have originally been a souvenir. And it shows this. That's the photograph. And the dead giveaway is, I'm not allowed to move, otherwise you won't hear me apparently, so otherwise I'd point it out, but I have a laser point here. You can see there's a turret, and actually the flame where it was painted in is somewhere up here. I'll take that back so you can, see, fooled us all till the original photograph showed up. So yes, it is a fake. And we know the book that it first came into. It's been etched on glass, but that's the original photograph. And so it was important to go through these. The other thing that's happened is some photographs of the battle have been attributed to other events apart from the ones they actually were. That too had to be sort of unpicked. But getting on to the archaeology, I wanted to start at the start of the battle with the first ship to be lost. This was the British battlecruiser Indefatigable that sank very early on in the battle. It blew up. Nearly everybody on board was killed. This site was unknown in 2000 when we first started diving out there. Nobody knew where it was. And by working with Get Norman, he gave me some positions which local fishermen had said they had lost some nets on. And it was by diving those that we found Indefatigable. And I've got some video of the actual first time that we saw it, which I think comes now. Yes, here it is. The little propeller you can see here is from one of the ship's tenders. This is our downline coming in, it's been hooked in. I'm swimming around with a video camera. This is the armoured wall of an upside down 12-inch turret. You can see the counterbalance here. That's the escape hatch at the back of the turret, which is open. So this 12-inch turret has been bodily thrown up into the air and has landed on the seabed upside down. This is actually a gun from another turret that's just completely exploded. It's broken out of its trunnion down on that corner. You can see the recoil cylinder. No doubt about what it was. 12-inch guns. Stick your hand in front of the video camera. It's a quick way of measuring the 7-inch armoured plate, which you can see there. Here's one of the the mast, probably the main mast of the ship, which is now very, very broken, as you can see, quite corroded. Here's one of the platforms. Big davit chains there at the back. So, you know, within 20 minutes to half an hour of swimming around this site, we had a fair appraisal of what was going on. Here's a 4-inch gun, very, very damaged remains of a Yarrow type boiler, a very broken up, very distorted site. This, as it turns out, has been a combination of the the circumstances of its destruction and its immersion in a very, very dynamic marine environment, which is the North Sea, where, during the course of our dives, even on the deeper ones, such as Queen Mary, it's not uncommon for the swell to push us around while we're on the bottom. So 100 years of that happening every day, this suction and pumping motion as water is pushed through these wrecks, is breaking them up, and they are breaking up quickly now. Here's another 4-inch gun. And I'll just let this tape run on for a little bit longer. Lovely visibility, about 50 meters down, so the time that we had to dive on the sites was quite limited. And you can see, as we're coming back up the line, you get a very good impression of everything that's down there. And I just wanted to point out that person there. That's my wife, who's in the audience this evening. So she was one of the early Jutland explorers. Now, in 2015, when we went back with multi-beam, we could look at Indefatigable in a completely new way. This is a multi-beam image of the site. Here's the bow. This is the remains of a turret with the forward magazine, obviously completely atomized at one point. The two center turrets are here, and we know now by further work that the area that we dived on in 2001 was here. And it was quite interesting, and this image is in the book, along with another one that was taken at the time. You can do some really amazing things with multi-beam in terms of doing measurements, doing height measurements, and when you get very, very good resolution, as we were getting, you can see some very, very fine detail. And one of the things that troubled me, when I wrote the book, was the fact that what we actually have there is about 40 meters too short. That's 40 meters too short to be indefatigable. So is it not indefatigable, or was there a piece of it missing? And I speculated in the book that we may have had a concertinaing effect whereby the ship sank by the stern and actually crushed itself, so when it's landed on the seabed, it's come up short. But I wasn't very satisfied with that answer. But the following year, after the book had been published, of course, we went out there again. Get Norman very graciously laid on 2 more expeditions out there that year for us to sort of tidy up some of the corners. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to look at Indefatigable again and see whether we might have missed something, because in 2015 we had a lot of shipwrecks to look at, and we were in quite a hurry to get it all done. So that's 2015, April 2015. You can see the way the seabed is disturbed. The deeper parts, the bluer deeper parts, are craters left over from 100 years, still there from when the ship exploded, untouched. But the piece that was missing was found after 2 or 3 hours of mowing the seabed with the multi-beam, half a kilometre away, back there. And this tells us a completely unique story about what happened to Indefatigable that does not appear in any of the eyewitness accounts, not even in the gunners on Von der Tann, the German battle cruiser that was firing at Indefatigable. None of them tell you what happened. Only the archaeology tells you. Here we go. This is the stern. You can see the 2 rudders. There's the point of the stern. There's actually a whole turret sitting here. That's the armoured sleeve. And here's X turret lying on the bottom with its guns. We put an ROV down, remotely operated vehicle, it's a robot. And you can see some of the features here. This is actually exactly the same as we saw on the start of the last video. It's the back of a turret. There's the counterbalance. The escape hatch you can just make out. It's coming in there. This is, again, your standard Vickers constructed 12-inch turret. It's there. Here's your 12-inch guns. There's a pair of them. There's another one there. Yes. And the rest of the material that we would expect to see on the site was there. How is it that you've got a section of a ship half a kilometre away from the rest of it? And how do we reconcile what the archaeology is saying to what little visual accounts we have of the time? And the story itself, I think, is actually tragic, but at the same time quite interesting. Of course, this is the famous photograph which shows Indefatigable as it started to sink. That's the bow. So from the first multi-beam, we know from sketches that survive, that shortly after this photograph was taken, the forward section of the ship exploded. And that's what we saw on the original multi-beam in 2015. What has happened before that, which you just catch on the wider area of this, is this pall of smoke back here. And that's actually where the other part of the ship must be. And what has happened is that von der Tann has hit Indefatigable almost immediately, within the first 4 or 5 minutes. And the round has penetrated the roof of the X turret and has blown the stern of the ship off. The explosion, it's a supersonic shockwave, has travelled through the ship and killed everybody. But the ship has just kept going because it's travelling so fast. It's just kept going for half a kilometre, slowly turning away and slowly rolling over. And when it's got onto its side, with all that ready ammunition sitting inside it, it has voluntarily exploded as it sunk. And so this awful photograph is made even worse by knowing the fact that what we're looking at there is a completely dead ship. And what also is quite interesting about this image is that the gunners on von der Tann, and the gunnery log from von der Tann survives, that we know they were still firing at it at this point. Here's you've got a splash. So they were not aware of what they'd done early on. In fact, nobody could have known. And in the line of battle cruisers, there are almost no witnesses to this event. It's happened so quickly, and it's happened so early. The only written account that we have that shows any detail is the one that you see on the slide, and he's not seen anything like what has actually happened. Archaeology. And here you are. If you look at Indefatigable now, here you are. Here's the magazine that was under this turret. This is the bit that we found in 2016. This is the part we dived on, the main part, and this was the result of the second explosion when it sunk that destroyed that part. So we now have the full, well, as full as you're going to get, I think, story of actually what happened to this ship. And it is quite strange, and I do have to kick myself sometimes to think that it's 100 years has passed, and then archaeology has had a space in which it can breathe, where it can tell its own story about what has happened and contribute, I think, in this case, quite significantly to what we know. Now, the next battle cruiser to sink was Queen Mary. The exhibition here, of course, is an absolutely fantastic model of Queen Mary that I came to look at early on today as well. And, of course, this is regarded to have been one of the most beautiful ships the Royal Navy ever possessed. And, of course, it was Germany's greatest moment at sea with the destruction of this vessel. And, again, Queen Mary threw up some surprises too. One of the things that came up originally was the attribution of photographs. This photograph you'll see in some of the published literature as supposedly representing Indefatigable. I think publishers have required a narrative where there's a photograph of every ship or more, but in actual fact the original roll of photographs is in the National Archives. It's captioned by the photographer, and it quite clearly states that it's actually the genesis of what became the famous photograph of this massive plume of smoke representing a cordite explosion inside a confined space with venting out in the way that you see it here. Some video from 2000. This is the year before, when before we found Indefatigable. Queen Mary was known. It had been subject to a television documentary a few years before, and so we were only looking at something that was a known site. But some interesting things. The wreck section we were on was completely upside down. You can see some boiler tubes down there at the back. Splits in the hull. It's starting to slump, or it was back then, starting to slump and break open. So you can see down inside. Here's the access hatch on the end of one of the 42 Yarrow-type boilers that powered the ship. 42 boilers. 42. 13.5-inch rounds. Here mixed up with Clarkson cordite cases, which was a good indication of the fact that the wreck had actually collapsed quite a lot, and that the magazine, the very heavy shells, had fallen down into it. Just the way that these ships break down. But quite clearly we were looking at a magazine here that was not involved in the explosion of the ship, otherwise we wouldn't be looking at any ordnance at all. So there's one portion of it which we kind of thought was probably the stern, just from what other divers were telling us, but we weren't really sure until 2003. That's what we were looking at. But it's quite a small area. In 2003, when we were doing the Discovery program, we had a remotely operated vehicle, which of course doesn't tire and doesn't have decompression obligations, so we could spend hours looking at the wreck with this vehicle. And we found what actually turned out to be X-turret here at the back of it, of the ship, lying on the seabed. Here's the armoured sleeve, again upside down, like all the other turrets we'd seen. Going back now, this is video from the same area, but this is video from 2000. And right down in the scour at the bottom, in the deepest of all the Jutland shipwrecks, and just over 60 metres, You could look up, understand, there's the rangefinder at the back of the turret, a propeller again from one of the ship's tenders, unburned sticks of cordite lying around, coal. So this part of the ship was untouched by the explosion that sunk it. But what did it represent? That was always the question. And it wasn't one that we were easily going to answer by diving. We had a very primitive side-scanning sonar in 2003 that didn't work very well, primarily because the production company were not interested in its data, and so we only ever used it and it was too rough to do anything else, which is the worst conditions to try and use one of these pieces of equipment. So it was almost a hiding to nothing. But we did capture some images and could see quite clearly, well, with a bit of wishful thinking perhaps, that was the stern, but there was a lot more material out here. And if the path of the Queen Mary had been in this way, why was the stern down here, seemingly so intact, and why was all this wreckage up here? It was one of those mysteries that I knew we could get to the bottom of if we had the technology and we had the time to study this ship properly, and I had to wait so long for the opportunity to do that. But thanks to Get Norman, we were able to, and the step change in technology from 2003, with the multi-beam, the incredible technology that it is that comes along, was able to tell us that's where we were in 2000, just in this area here. That's the turret that we looked at with the ROV. This section of the wreck has changed, but I'll come back to that. This is what was the rest of it, with pieces all the way out here. At the end of 2016, one evening we got to Queen Mary with VNet, and we put the remotely operated vehicle down, and we went round and looked at every single piece that we could find on the multi-beam and recorded it. And it took quite a long time, and in fact, it was about 11, 12 o'clock at night when Gert came down to the ROV shack and he said, "Innes, the ROV pilot has to go to bed." I was like, "No, please, another 20 minutes." But we were actually, at that point, about there, and we pretty much recorded all of it, and that's what it represents. How did the bow end up there and the stern end up down there is the real question. And the answer is that, in fact, the whole bow has exploded, and the stern has just kept going, rather like Indefatigable, under its own momentum. It's just passed over the rest of it as the ship has disappeared, and then rolled around and turned over and sunk. And again, this is what we're looking at. This is the part that we dived in 2000, and this is the part that had fully exploded. There is one eyewitness, only one, William Cave, HMS Dublin, who actually sees this event, but I think he's seeing this event anyway. You can make up your own minds when you look in the book, but he's seeing it, but he's not, in his own mind, how can any man or person possibly make out that they're seeing a mighty warship, almost 2/3 of it disappear, and the last part of it just motor on in the way that it did, and roll over and sink. And he talks about having had nightmares and the rest. There is a sketch actually showing the stern section sinking as well. That was amazingly helpful when I came across that in the Liddell collection. Moving on to the night action now, and to my mind, whenever I think about all the work that I've ever done at Jutland, this is where I go. I'm always drawn to this particular case because it's so awful, I think, in some ways, and because we learn so much. Black Prince, if you read the material that's around at the time from the battle, and the newspapers through the 1920s into the 1930s, where there's a speculation about what happens to it, because there are no British witnesses to this event at all. There's only what the Germans say, and there's problems with that at the time. Obviously, historically, not so much now. And the speculation is always what happened to this ship. We know it was in the battle line with the rest of its squadron, which included Defence and Warrior, which I'll come on to, that were sunk. And then it sort of disappears from the British narrative of the battle. There's a radio signal at about 8:30 at night saying that it has seen a submarine, and it had seen something, but it wasn't a submarine. And then nothing. And then from German accounts, we work out that it had appeared next to a line of German battleships that had opened fire on it and sunk it with everybody on board. Now, this site was known in 2000, and it was one of only 4 that were known when we first started going out there. And it sits on a mud bank in about 38 metres of water. The underwater visibility is awful, and swimming around the outside of it, on basically an upturned hull, it was practically impossible to really try to understand what had been going on. And then it was multi-beam in conjunction with remotely operated vehicle inspection together which opened up the whole narrative about what the last moments of this ship and what had happened to it. Here's some photographs from 2000 and, well, these are actually 2001, all of them. On one dive, we ended up on one end of it, and I couldn't work out whether it was the stern or the bow. I suspected it may have been the stern, and we came across one of the turrets. The single gun turret, but the gun had gone. That was the gun mount. Decking was quite in condition, but the gun on the roof had gone, suggesting, of course, big explosion. In 2015, we were able to put the ROV in. That is actually the view out through that port, and the ROV was inside there, seeing if we could see any evidence of ammunition being piled up inside that we know was a practice that was occurring at the time. And what is revealed is that the wreck is upside down, and we dived this area in 2000 and just seen an upside down wreck. And the 2001, we'd been on this section, and it hinted at what we were seeing. That's the turret. This photograph is that turret. There's propellers and the rest here. So we know this is the stern. Obviously, that's the bow. Major area of damage all down this side. That's just been chewed out by shell fire, I think, by the look of it. Armour belt has been pulled out of it at some point, probably salvage activity, difficult to know. But the wreck there is upside down. We had an inspection. Nick was with us where we went round with the ROV. One of the things that we found, these four photographs shows the torpedo flat, where the torpedo was fired out sideways out of the ship. The deflector arm, which creates an eddy from the torpedo, can be fired without bending as it's coming out of the tube, was open. And it suggested very much as if somebody on Black Prince was trying to fire a torpedo. Now, it's just quite interesting because one of the accounts on the German side says that they thought Black Prince, once it had been detected, shaped for a torpedo attack before it turned away. And it looks very much as if that may well have been the case. That fin has definitely been employed to fire a torpedo. And interestingly, the tube is empty, so the torpedo was fired. But the ship was then sunk, as we'll see. There's an interesting anecdote that I found recently in relation to this awful tragedy where all the crew were killed. But of course, Black Prince, like all of these great ships, had a life, and a long life. In the Mediterranean, before the First World War, it was serving with the fleet, and there was a man by the name of Gilbert Stevenson, who some of you may have come across, known as the Terror of Tobermory. He was the trainer. He was an old man by the Second World War, but he was training anti-submarine crews. But back then, he was a very young officer in charge of this torpedo flat. And like everybody else in the Royal Navy, he was obsessed with rate of fire. And so he throws the rule book for firing torpedoes over the side, metaphorically, and trains his team how to rapidly fire torpedoes, one after another. And when he's decided that he can do this, and his team are absolutely drilled, he gets Philip of Battenberg of the fleet to come down and witness the new firing practices being developed inside HMS Black Prince. And unsurprisingly, after the first torpedo is fired, both doors of the tube are accidentally left open, and the entire torpedo flat flooded with water, and the Admiral in full uniform had to be dragged up a ladder, trying to be pumped out. And anyway, Battenberg went away and changed his uniform and never reported the incident. And so Stevenson's career went on unimpeded, but it actually happened in that room. So, get two sides, humorous and obviously tragic, but all these ships have a life. What has actually happened is that this magazine, not the one under X-turret, funnily enough, but this one here has blown up. Maybe as a result of a direct hit, maybe as a result of flash. We don't know. It's very tempting to think that you can actually take that little bit of it there and plug it into there, and you've got the whole length of the ship, but you don't. This piece was part of the ship, and it's completely disappeared when the ship blew up. And there you are. Now, the other thing to mention about Black Prince is that as archaeologists, we have a term called agency, which we use. And agency, when you're studying any object, agency is if you can see something in it when a human being has made a decision. Now, that might be difficult if you're looking at a pot. It's not that much hard when you're looking at something as large as a battleship, but as what I always say is one of the ways that you always detect agency in a shipwreck is simply look at the way it's pointed. Because somebody's decided to steer it in that direction. Yeah. What you learn by just looking at the way Black Prince is pointed and the direction it was actually heading when it sunk, it would have gone pretty much straight down, as it did, is that it's actually turned away. And we left then with a very tragic conclusion that Black Prince comes into the German line like this. It thinks, we have to assume, that this is British battleships, and it's going to take a position astern. The Germans see it coming. They have searchlights that are linked into their gunnery systems. They are prepared. They know how to fight at night properly. And they turn the lights on, and Black Prince then turns away. This ship here is the one that said that it thought the torpedo was going to be fired. The Black Prince then has done a handbrake turn to try and get out of there as it can, and had actually managed to get stern on to its tormentors, but it wasn't enough. But you're left with this awful thought that the guys on the bridge for a short period of time must have thought they were going to get away with this colossal, horrible error, but it wasn't to be. So in some ways we've really put the story of the last few minutes of this ship together, and it's completely unknown before. Now, this is not in my book because this again occurred back at the end of 2016, but I added in just because there are 22 of the 25 ships in my book. The other 3 have all been accounted for now. If anything, Gert Norman, rather like myself, is a completer, and we really did have to close the book and have them all, which we've now done. The other material has been published, when the last one is in the process of being published now, so it will all be in the public domain within the next 2 months. Warrior had a story. It was one of the ones, rather like Sparrowhawk, which was one of the other ones we did, that it had a life after the battle in the fact that it was being towed away. And therefore it was of low priority to us because it was difficult to look for because of that. It had been badly damaged at the time that defence was destroyed, and Black Prince went AWOL, and it drifted out of the battle and its engines stopped. And the battle moves away, and it's just sitting there. And very fortunately for her, Engadine, Rutland of Jutland, a cross-channel ferry with some seaplanes on it, spotted Warrior just sitting there and took the ship in tow. And throughout the night they tried to get it back across the North Sea. All the indications are from the weather that it was worsening throughout the night. And this is corroborated by the Met Office records that show that the sea was getting worse. The ship was gradually filling with water, and they were unable to contain it. So at some point, the decision had to be made to abandon her. And what becomes interesting at that point is then what do they do? Because you've got the photograph here. Engadine comes alongside. All the crew managed to get off Warrior pretty much. I mean, some had obviously been killed in the action. There was a nasty incident when the 2 ships came together. But nearly, for all intents and purposes, the crew get off onto Engadine, and they just left Warrior. Because Engadine's not armed, so they couldn't shoot at it. So with the captain, Moltano's view was that the ship was likely to sink within an hour or so, so they left it. And it appears that it actually stayed afloat for quite a while, because it's nowhere near the positions they were given for where it was lost. This map of the North Sea shows all of the shipwrecks up to August 2016 that I'd looked at with Gert Norman during this time. The Jutland ones are in here, but we've done a lot of work down here. And this was the survey that we went on. All of these represent shipwrecks. And Warrior was right up here at the end. In fact, we thought it might have been there, but it's come back. And it's drifted with the wind several miles back towards Norway from the position it was thought to have been abandoned in. And this is what it looked like. Now, by far the deepest of all the Jutland wrecks, way down in nearly 90 meters of water. The systems on Vina, with its multi-beam, actually creates almost, if you like, a 3D environment. There's Vina. That's on the surface up there, 80 meters, 89 meters above from the scour. And this is the multi-beam rendering of Warrior on the seabed with its scour there. And that is what Warrior looked like when we passed over it with the multi-beam. In the middle of the night. It was about 11:30 at night, I think, 11 o'clock, something about that time, when we finally picked her out. Warships of this type give a particular signature on multi-beam, which is difficult to miss in terms of their dimensions of length and the beam of them. And the ship works, apart from what I've just said about ROV guy wanting to go to bed early on in the year, we'd managed to get an ROV guy who was going to work at whatever time it is, 11:15, as you can see there on the clock. We put the ROV down, no doubt about what it is. One of the most interesting aspects of it is it had these very large 4 turrets down the side of the ship that were quite substantial. The ship was built around the turrets that had actually, I believe, been designed for another purpose. And they actually overhang the side of the ship. And one of the things, you can see it on the drawing, but one of the things that confirms what it is that you can see that overhang very clearly there. It also had a walkway that actually stuck out over the side of the ship up towards the bow, and that in quite a lot of sections of that actually survived. And there was a number of other features as well that confirm without doubt what it was. Here's the multi-beam, absolutely correct length and breadth. Interestingly, the main damage has been caused around the stern, and what we think, and what the captain's appraisal of what was likely to happen to the ship was it would sink by the stern. We didn't look at these, but I now do wonder whether they are actually the exit holes from the 2 rounds that were known to pass through the engine room. And if we ever do go back, that'd be the first place we'd go to. And so what has happened probably is it's sunk by the stern. Of course, the ship is longer than the sea is deep, so it's hit the bottom, and then it's twisted. And as it's twisted and rolled over, this is what's caused the damage that we see on the underside. Ships of this type always roll over because the turrets are heavy, and they make for the vessel to become the way up that it really wants to be, ultimately, when it starts filling with water. And there's a little video here, this is on YouTube, done by JD Contractor in the Seawall Museum, Jutland, and it shows how all the systems on the ship, when they are integrated, work together. So you can see that's where the ROV is. Here's our propeller, and the ROV will then jump, and you'll see it'll move and look at some of the other features. That's now about there. That's a propeller, one of the ship's tenders, as we've seen on so many of these wrecks already in the course of this talk. When the ship has gone down, when its tender's still on it, then it's a good indication of what's happened. A little bit further along, the masts are very broken. In fact, when it hit the seabed, it must have come down right on top of the masts, because they're not. When a ship rolls sideways, the masts come out on the seabed sideways, as we see on Lutzow, for instance. But with this one, it's come right down on the mast, and they've been crushed underneath the ship. There's not a lot showing at all. Here's one of the sides of the turrets. The armoured structure here is split. Actually, the pieces of armour are coming apart, so the weight of the ship is slowly breaking it up. You can quite clearly see the armour plate on the side of the turret there has broken. Lots of healthy cod swimming about. But also after, we needed less than an hour on this site to confirm what it was. The fact is that as good as it was and how nice it was to find this and sort of round off discovery of all the ships sunk at Jutland, this is the only one that I can say hand on heart has not been interfered with by criminality of some sort or another, or by metal theft. So it's the last one. And there's been some work to make sure that this one does not get messed around with, and I'm very glad that's happened. Now that's looked at all the big ones. We now spend a little bit of time looking at the torpedo boats and the destroyers, because the majority of the ships sunk are of that size. These small guys have their own narrative in the battle, which is just as awful as the big guys. They're fighting each other quite often, sometimes in close quarters. They're also involved in some pretty terrifying action at night, which leads to the ones that you see sunk there. Now, they're not armoured, and they're very lightly built. The North Sea has chewed these away over 100 years, so that there's not a lot left of them. And this is where really the skills of archaeological science come into their own. Is like, how can we can we find them? And if we can, how can we tell them apart? And if we can do that, can we actually learn anything about what happened to them when they sank? And that in itself was quite a challenge. But multi-beam had the answer, ultimately. This is what they tend to look like. So with few exceptions, this is Ardent, built by William Denny in Dunbarton. That one's, I think, the best condition of all of them. But a lot of them, this one here is Tipperary. A lot of them are just assemblages of machinery. These tend to be boilers. And so what I learned by looking at the multi-beam that we see there, backed up with remotely operated vehicle inspection of these sites, is that there are a number of features that are different between British and German ones of the heavy machinery that is left. And they fall down basically to the types of boilers being used. The Germans were actually using a British-designed boiler, but it was different from the type being used in the British ships. So there's a big difference in boilers, and that has helped enormously to help pick them apart visually. Also, the turbine arrangements were quite different. And the way that the pieces of machinery are left out on the seabed, so long as the wreck has not been disturbed after it is on the bottom, then they tend to be where they are. And so the trick was to come here to speak to Andrew at the ship's plans department and draw the plans for every class of destroyer that was sunk in the battle, get on the hold level and make a schematic, make what we would call in archaeological terms a typology, to see if that would help us with the multi-beam images, and this is what I did. It's a typology, typical. This could be Samian ware from the Roman army, or whatever. It's exactly the same thing. What are the differences, and can we use this to help work out archaeologically what we're looking at? And here we are. These are all the classes of torpedo boat that were sunk at Jutland. And this is the heavy machinery. You've got your turbines, your condensers, and your boilers, and they're all different types. And once I'd done this, and this was like quite a long time, the plans arrived all rolled up, big, large photocopies, and I took them to the gantry place where I live, and we had them digitized, and then I drew them out and put them like that, and I made this. And this takes a couple of days to do all this work and make this typology, and I actually said to myself, I am not going to look at the multi-beam data until this is right, and then I'm going to look, and if it works, then it's really good, and if it doesn't, it's an idea I'm never going to tell anybody about. And as it was, it did work. It was an evening, wasn't it, Patricia, I think, when I laid it on there, and there was a sort of eureka moment that this was really going to resolve the differences between them. And you can see here that the boilers line up particularly well in these cases, and they do tell the difference. And even some cases where you can see the central line of the boiler, the upper boiler is gone. It's been an explosion. Some of the boilers exploded when the onrush of seawater came in, and we know that from records that survive. So we were able to use this tool to identify every single torpedo boat and destroyer down to its class. Now, there's several examples of some class. Some are unique, like Tipperary, others are others. And then it was simply saying, where are they in the narrative of the battle? And I go back to what I said earlier on in my talk about we were helped immensely by the fact that the three battles that are Jutland didn't overlap. And then it was a process of identification using the tapes from the ROV and the material that was there. And I'm satisfied that in every case we were able to identify which one of these were which. And that leads us on ultimately then to something that I never really thought I'd get involved in, which is to look at some of the wider historical implications of the battle. We had, of course, the Jutland controversy, which went on throughout the 1920s, of which there have been numerous books and the rest written out, and a lot of people have got, to this day, quite strong opinions about. And what I did was look at the Harper material, because Harper, of course, wrote this chronology of the battle that had its publishing prevented by Beatty, by the First Sea Lord at the time. And there was a bit of a furore about this. In some ways, it became rather like the sort of Chilcot of its period, would be the way that I liken it when I'm teaching my students about this. And what we actually find is there's nothing wrong with the Harper record at all. In fact, it's a remarkably good piece of work. Harper was the head of the Navigational School of the Royal Navy. He was tasked with simply making a chronology of the battle. And he was told, you're not allowed to speak to anybody. He's only allowed to use radio signals, track charts, gunnery logs, and other paper ephemera that survives from the battle. And he laboured with an enormous team, we don't know how many, of individuals over several months to go through all of this data and draw it all together. In 1927, he sought, 1920, earlier than that, I think, he sought permission to send a minesweeper out into the North Sea to look for HMS Invincible, the battle cruiser that had been lost, because it happened at the moment where Jellicoe and Beatty's two sets of drawings could then be drawn together. He finds Invincible very, very close to where it is now. Actually, the navigational accuracy is inside half a mile, which is remarkably good for being in the middle of the North Sea, and draws all of this material together and produces some fantastic charts, of which Nick Jellicoe very graciously gave me copies that helped know endlessly with this work. And what we see here is, in this diagram, is the results of it. When you know where all the ships are, you just line them up. The red lines represent the differences. The black crosses are Harper, the blue flags are where the wrecks are. There's a few long ones. Wiesbaden, of course, drifted all night before it sunk. Sparrowhawk was towed and was sunk in the morning. Rostock and Lützow were sunk without any British witnesses. But where there is British evidence, the positions are remarkable. And you think that these two massive battle fleets had crossed the North Sea at night and they'd gone in the afternoon into a naval battle. The work being carried out by the navigational teams on all of those ships I find quite extraordinary. And more than that, I find the work of Harper being able to draw this all together, using age of sail navigation in the age of steam, effectively, and create what is actually remarkably accurate chronology of events. We've sort of, in some ways, vindicated Harper's work. I haven't vindicated it, the shipwrecks have, because the shipwrecks have spoken, and they're the ultimate arbiters. And they say Harper did a good job. And we know that John Harper had a son who served in the Royal Navy, and I know Nick and I have tried to make contact with the Harper family, and I don't know whether they've seen my book or not, but I do sincerely hope one of the outcomes of all of this is to let the Harper family know that there's absolutely nothing wrong with the Harper record, as of course they know. There he is. 1927, his book comes out, The Truth About Jutland. It sold so well, you still see it for 50p in Oxfam and things like that. If you've not read it, you should, because it is The Truth About Jutland. And I think our book sort of, the studies of all the wrecks sort of show that. I want to come on now briefly to talk about some of the less edifying aspects of the work that I've done. This involves salvage. The salvage falls into two distinct phases. The first is what happens after the end of the Second World War. This is, as far as we can tell, officially approved. This is Lützow, Hipper's battlecruiser flag of the first scouting group, the German fleet, and it shows quite precise cutting from back here in the stern where the propellers have been removed and the telemotors, and you can see all of this. If you look on the ship's plans, you can line all of this up very accurately, and you can see that this cutting has been done from above. To do that, you need to put a salvage ship over the wreck, you have to moor it down, and you have to spend a lot of time. There are the notices to mariners from 1960, I think, again, my memory's fading me, but actually show this work, and it's being publicly, don't go into this area, you're going to run into a salvage ship which is moored over this wreck. So it's being done, presumably with official sanction, otherwise it would never appear in the notice to mariners. But this is, of course, after the war when there's a need for metals. After a war, people are far less sensitive about talking about what has happened, and so you tend to see this as sort of the thing that goes on. Certainly this one has been salvaged in this way, and probably the battleship Pommern too. These are quite close to shore as well, which makes them easy targets. So they were found and worked on in the 1960s. But times move on. And by the time you get to the 1970s and the 1980s, the wrecks take on another life. They take on a life where people are starting to recognise what they are and starting to recognise that they are the final resting places of 8,500 people like you and me, who died wet, frightened, didn't want to be there, died in the service of their country, and have a completely legitimate right to be left alone. And so when I see that the wrecks are being interfered with, it upsets me. On a personal level, it upsets me greatly. And I know I'm not alone in this. I have no relatives at Jutland. I had relatives in the Navy, but I had nobody at Jutland. But no many you have. And so when you see that the reason Tipperary doesn't have an engine room is because it's been ripped out, leaving a crater in the seabed where it once was, the condensers are what they've been looking for. And you again consistently see across all of the torpedo boats that the condensers are missing. I didn't put that typology together to prove this point. It just happens that it does. With very, very few exceptions, every single one of these has been found by somebody before us, and they've been taking out the valuable metals. So they've all been disturbed. This famous series of photographs now that's been all over the internet, including these ones. This is from Queen Mary. And this has come out of a part of Queen Mary that I showed you a video of in 2000. And the firm that did this broke the ship open to get them out and completely destroyed what I've got. The only record that survives of how Queen Mary looked before they went to work is that video I showed you. That's it. The damage that was done, do you remember me showing you this split in the hull here, and there's the magazine? Well, that's what it looks like now. It's that area there. It's just been chopped out to pull the condensers out. And a hell of a lot of damage has been done to the wreck. This is what I would call, this is the bottom end of industrial scale looting. But we must remember that as bad as this is, it's nothing compared to what we've seen in the Java Sea, where we've seen entire ships completely disappear. I mean, you put a cruiser the size of HMS Exeter, who fought the Grass Bay, doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. With its crew, gone. And we have to put a stop to it, because we'll have nothing left. Indefatigable propellers are in that section that's half a mile away. This one shows up. Somebody there before us? This was found in a scrapyard in Holland. The guy went in there and said, "Can I have the locking nut off the back?" And they said to him, "Well, it's been melted down, so you've got the morning." So he, with his own money, went and hired a road drill and went back and drilled it off. And it's now in Holland in a museum. But that's come from Indefatigable. And I've just shared with you the awful story of how that ship sunk. And words fail me to understand how anybody could have the mindset to think that that is acceptable behaviour. This is the list. It's in the Mariner's Mirror article, pretty much up to date. So you can see it all then, but you can see that condensers and other items have gone from most of them now. And it's kind of sad, really, because we need to make sure that other next generations that come along come to understand what Jutland was, come to understand what naval conflict in the 20th century, what it represented. We need the archaeology to be there. And we need people of our generation to be seen to be treating it with a proper degree of respect. Now, it's in the middle of the North Sea. Nobody can ever plausibly expect the German or the British Navy to post a gunboat over the wreck site to stop people going there. But times move on. And there is, paid for by the British government, an incredible organisation sitting just outside London that has the capability to monitor all of these sites using satellite technology. Not only monitoring them, but monitoring the activity of every single salvage ship at sea. And this is what we're working on. Warrior, I know, is being monitored now, and it's not the only site. The German government, the American government, the British, increasingly so, are doing more of this work. And so I hope that by highlighting what has happened at Jutland, I've helped perhaps drive that agenda forward slightly. You'll be pleased to know, and I was delighted, that the particular individuals you saw who removed that condenser from Queen Mary were nicked, doing exactly the same thing on a site in British waters last year, and have pleaded guilty in a court for doing so. So there is evidence now that these miscreants are going to be dealt with. And I want to see more of this because it's our heritage. Just because it's under the sea doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I hope if I've shown you anything tonight, studying naval history from the bottom up can lead to some really interesting changes in our understanding of events. Thank you. Thank you very much.